Coming up this week on the show, we've got Dan Phillips, product manager for Korg R&D in the US, talking to us about his role at Korg and the synths that he's been working on over the years, going right back to the Wavestation and right up to my current favourite, the Modwave and the Wavestate. So we're going to be talking to Dan about the products he's worked in over the years, the genesis of things like the Modwave and the Wavestate, how Raspberry Pi has affected synthesizer development, and we'll even be talking about some new products that are coming up from Korg, some new software coming up from Korg later this year as well. I think you're going to really enjoy this one, so let's get straight to Dan. Dan Phillips, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Ian. It's great to see you.
It's really exciting for me to get you on the show, because I know you from Korg R&D, and Korg R&D in the US have produced some amazing synths, so got lots of things to talk about. And of course, recently I've been doing loads with the Wavestate and Modwave, particularly the Modwave, which is there. But I did get my Wavestate on Friday last week.
Cool.
Module. So I've got the module sat on my desk, ready to start playing. But I know you've been responsible for, or worked on some amazing products. So just before we go into sort of the newer stuff, just tell me, what's your role at Korg now and what sort of products you've worked on?
Well, so we're a pretty small group. I'm manager of product development, and that means kind of all sorts of things. So it means I'm in charge of what we call product planning for my group, so trying to figure out what we'll make, and that's always a combination of what excites me and what can excite our team, and then what can excite Korg Inc., and then what can excite all the distributors. And so when we find something that everyone thinks is cool and will sell, then we can move forward and set all the gears in motion and start to make it. And then I work on the detailed spec for the device. So in the case of the Modwave and Wavestate, it's what knobs are on the front panel, how does it make sound, what are the basics of how the instrument is set up and how things are put together, and what are the interesting things in it. So Wave Sequencing 2.0 was mostly me, and Chaos Physics was mostly my idea, and having these ideas for these kind of strange things. And I'm not an engineer, so working with the engineers to say, well, I want these things, and I want the lanes to be different, and I want it kind of to be like total serialism in the mid 1900s, and what can we do to make that? Or with Chaos Physics, it's like we want this plane, we want to be able to tilt it and play with it and scoot a ball around on this plane. And then the engineers, who are fantastic engineers, figure out how to do it and come up with other new and cool ideas along the way. And then we all, get together and make it. And sometimes I'll say, hey, can it do this thing? And they will say, no, it absolutely cannot. And so I say, well, okay, how can we do something else that will fit in? And so that's that part of the job. And then I write manuals as well, and I help to write marketing copy, and I help the marketing guys to figure out how to sell the instrument. I work with the sound developers, we call the voicing team. I work with the sound developers to understand how the instrument works and maybe understand some of the more interesting or unique things that it can do, and then work with them to make the sounds. And for the Wavestate and Modwave, I was one of two people. My boss, the general manager of our group, Andy Leary, also helped with managing the sounds for those. So the two of us kind of put together, what we want the instrument to sound like, how the sounds should represent the instrument. And then finally I help the marketing guys to sell it. What are the interesting things that you guys can talk about with this? Sometimes I'll make initial internal demo videos or initial internal marketing documents, and a lot of it is about getting a message out and getting everyone on the same team. So many different hats there, but that's.
And you're also quite active within sort of various communities as well around the products that you're working on supporting. So I've seen you engaged in lots of different places, sort of helping out, and always you see the questions, and then you've always got the bit of the manual that's relevant. I do like how you paste that in there. Okay, that's the bit you need to read.
I really try to do that. And one of the things is that, I write manuals because I don't remember everything. So, for something like the Wavestate, which is, we released that in 2020, right? So that's 4 years ago now. And I don't necessarily remember everything that, every detail that we put into that device, but I wrote this manual, and at the time, these are the things that I thought people needed to understand and that I would need to understand later, right? So, I wrote the manuals, and I do think that people sometimes have had bad experiences with manuals in the past, and so they don't give much credence to them. Other people just don't like absorbing information through reading, and I understand that too. But I do always try to make the point that, if you look in the manual and if you look in the online help for the Modwave, for instance, for Modwave Native, you'll find a lot of things are actually explained there. So when people have questions that are pretty basic, I try to answer with that, and it does two things. One is that it gives a good answer to the question, and the other is that it points them to maybe how to fish next time.
Yeah. So I've used that, especially the online manual. I found it really handy. But in the old days, you got manuals, and I've got Korg manuals up there, where you get about 4 or 5 with the synth. The world's changed now. You don't get paper manuals, but the online manuals, particularly, I found helpful and searchable, and makes things easy.
I really like that. I really like the fact that with PDFs I can as you say, you can make things searchable, and also you can, all the hyperlinks are, you don't have to actually find page 762. You can just click on the thing and go there. So I try to do that stuff well.
Yeah, and I suppose the other good thing is that as these synths are a living thing, the documents are living things that go with it. Modwave 2 comes out, done up the second update, you then can revise the manual for it.
Yeah, and I think we were up to 6 or 7 or something like that on the Wavestate. Yeah, we definitely modded the Modwave also, and updated the help for that matter, the online help.
Yeah, it's pretty good. So, tell us about some of the products, other than we'll come to the recent stuff later, but some of the products that we may have heard of that you've worked on at Korg.
Well, you mean just throughout history?
Yes. I mean, I've checked out your website, so I know which ones you worked on. But yeah, tell us which ones, which are the highlights then.
Well, I mean, I think the first highlight, which I really didn't have very much to do with, was the Wavestation. So I came into Korg in April 1990, long time ago, fresh out of college, and the group was just finishing up the Wavestation, and I added exactly one feature of the Wavestation, which was the scale key. I noticed that there was no way of transposing scales, and so I suggested that was going to be an important thing. And then I took over the manuals, which again were almost already completely written from a very skilled guy named Stanley Youngley, who'd done the manuals for Sequential. And anyway, so the Wavestate was very cool, and that was sort of my entry to this sort of thing. But then just like a year and a half later, I started work on the Wavestation SR user interface. So that was the first user interface I did. And of course, it had to be very, very tiny. So there were all these restrictions. It had to fit in one rack unit, with a little 2x16 LCD, and figuring out how things would go, how we could express this really deep synthesizer with so few controls was a big challenge. And I think that, ultimately, people regard that as not the easiest UI, but I think it's not because of the UI, or it's not because of the choices that we made, but because of the basic restrictions of the hardware. So I feel pretally happy about that, actually. I think we did a pretty good job with it. And then we worked on the OASYS, the first one, based on our own internal DSPs and everything, and then that turned into the OASYS PCI, and that was a product that I did a lot of evangelism for, an early DSP card system. And then from there, we did the OASYS, which turned into the Kronos, based on Pentium systems, the first mass market synth based on a Pentium. There were others before that, like the Neuron, for instance, but those were more niche products. And so that was an exciting thing. And then we worked on some stuff that made it into the Vox Continental and Grand Stage products, and then the Wavestate and Modwave, and things to come.
And the Wavestation is probably one of my personal favorites. And a legacy that of all the things that it lives on and lives on, because you mentioned the Wavestate, and it has a legacy back from that Wavestation, which of course has a legacy from Prophet days. But definitely one of my favorite synths. And when Korg first launched the what's called Legacy Digital Collection at the time, I think, with the virtual version, that was one of the first things I got because I was such a fan of, because I'm a massive Genesis fan.
Oh,
and
yeah.
Tony Banks used it loads on We Can't Dance, and the mini lead and the warm pads, and there's so many sounds that are on that album that you can immediately pick out of a Wavestation. And in fact, one of the things I enjoy doing with the Modwave is recreating those sounds, because a lot of those sounds are there, aren't they? Those samples are there, and you can recreate them. So I find it fascinating that a synth you could buy, like the Wavestate that I've just got. So 2024 has its legacy all the way back to that product.
One of the cool things in the Wavestate, if you go to Ski Jam 2.0, you can kind of hear the idea of that patch, which I did, and that was a patch from Peter Schwartz, whose nickname is Ski, so I took his patch, and then I kind of Wave Sequence 2.0'd it. So you play it, and it's this very recognizable sound that was used on a bunch of songs and soundtracks, and on the Wavestation rather, it repeats. It's a 2-bar pattern that repeats, and it's a very, very cool pattern where it's switching out all these samples and doing this neat stuff. But then you can use the knobs on the Wavestate to constrict the lanes or stretch the lanes and make these entirely new patterns that come out of that basic pattern. And that's that for me. That patch for me kind of expresses the evolution from the Wavestation to the Wavestate.
Yeah. That's the first thing I look for, is that, and the right hand of that part, the lead, the lead sound, that mini lead sound, is what Tony Banks used on Fading Lights, and it's so instantly recognizable. That's why I love that, and then to be able to recreate that as I did on the Modwave was great, because it sort of took straight back to sort of 1990. But yeah, it's great. I mean, these are the things, I suppose, with software development, product development of synthesizers. It's a legacy that you're building on all the time, and I like the fact that you've managed to incorporate these things into it, and of course that brings us up to date then with the Wavestate and the Modwave. What was the genesis of those projects?
Well, the genesis of those projects was looking at a mini log and thinking, what could we do if we ripped out all the analog stuff from the mini log and stuffed in a digital synth? What could we do? And could we do something that was compelling and fun and small enough to fit in people's setups and inexpensive enough so that everyone could afford it? And so that was kind of how we started off. And we changed a few things. We thought that, especially for Western markets, that the full-size keys were important. And then we thought about, well, what synths can we come out with that would catch people's attention? And certainly there are lots of clones coming out right now. As it's easier to market a sequel. It's always easier to market a sequel. And with a clone, you don't even have to do your own R&D, really. You just use the specification that someone else made long ago, and you don't worry about it. But that doesn't seem very fun to me. So some of the synths that people were interested in were the one of the ones that came up most was the Wavestation, right? So we could recreate the Wavestation. That would be no problem at all. But I was interested in kind of exploring what the Wavestation did that was special, and what can we do to speak with that same voice now in a way that is perhaps as revolutionary as the Wavestation was back in 1990. So we looked around and we figured out that we could use these fabulous processors from Raspberry Pi, and they make versions that are for consumers, but they also make these things called the compute modules, which are intended for industrial applications. So they don't have ports on them. They kind of slot into your main board and connect to whatever connectors you've implemented. And it's a really neat system, and it turns out to be very, very cost effective for the amount of processing power you get. One of the things that people don't understand actually is that it costs a whole lot more than the internals in most analog synths, and a whole lot more than the internals in most digital synths. But it gives us a lot of processing power and a lot in one package. So it made it possible for us to make these synthesizers with so much processing power in a small and relatively affordable package. So you were asking about the genesis of the Wavestate. I mean, that's sort of that's a high level view of what we're thinking of with the instrument as a whole, but what to make it special. We had a few ideas that we'd been working on previously and sort of looking for how to implement them in an instrument. And so one of the ideas was this wave sequencing 2.0 thing. And the inspiration for that is something that really was never very popular with people, which was total serialism. This idea from the mid-20th century from composers like Pierre Boulez, based on ideas from a couple generations earlier from Schoenberg, of having, these sequences of pitches initially, but then Boulez and other people working on total serialism thought about it from the perspective of, well, we can add in things like volume and articulations and timbre. And so I thought, well, processors are fast enough. We can do all this stuff on the fly now. So instead of having to have a fixed set of steps, and each step has, what its timbre is and what its volume is, and what its crossfade time is, you can actually assemble from multiple menus of things. So, the idea was to have a set of samples and a set of volumes and a set of, in our case, shapes, and a set of other sequence information that we could go out and modulate something else with, and a set of timings, and have those sets be separate from one another, and so they could have different lengths, different numbers of things in the set, and they could loop differently if you wanted to. And basically, every time you want a step, you kind of pull something from each of these different lanes and spit it out. And then we added things like randomization for order in the lanes and probability for the steps. And there are some step sequencers that have done things about that before and since. And so this is taking some inspiration from modern modular step sequencers also. And you get these magical things because these series can be very short. So you can have just, 11 samples and 9 timings and, 8 step sequencer patterns. And so each of these things is very understandable. But when you combine them, they become something that's kind of wild and organic and somewhat unpredictable. And that's something that really excites me, is having something where you can have simple and understandable objects that when you combine them, create something entirely new and unexpected. I think that's a brilliant thing. So anyway, that's wave sequencing 2.0.
And then that became then the Wavestate was sort of built around that then.
Yeah. And I'm sorry, I'm still working on this. Is just my second cup of tea, so.
and then that's got like the sample engine with it, then, isn't it? So that's got all the samples that are built in, and you could then bring your own samples in. Was there what was the reason sort of being able of coming up with that idea to bring your own samples in? Because it opens it up massively as soon as you could do that.
Yeah, I mean, it's really it's pretty much an obvious thing. We had planned that from the beginning. It's not really implemented as a full-on sampler, as I think you've noticed. So it's more like a rompler that you can make your own ROMs for. That's the basic idea, and it's possible we'll expand it more in the future. But there's some things about the way that we load the samples that make it easier to do if you just have kind of a big block of samples to load. So, we had about 4 gigabytes free on the internal storage, and so we just opened that up to users, and it uses some of the RAM, right, and then a lot of the disk space because it's all streaming. So I don't know. I think it makes perfect sense to have done it that way, and I'm really glad that you and others are using that to good purposes.
Yeah, it does. It makes it, especially on both synths, to be able to break those, be able to just open up the sample editor on the PC. I found it a lot easier than trying to capture audio from the synth itself. You can do it all through the PC. You get the waveforms, you can see it all, and then once you're happy with it, transfer it over, and then it becomes, you can incorporate it in your wave sequences. So I think that's really good to do that. And I think it is. Initially, I thought it lends itself more to the Wavestate than the Modwave, but actually, having spent time with it, it doesn't. They're equal partners in kind of that. But yeah, I think it's a great idea to include that. So going to the Modwave, was the genesis the same thing then? You wanted to see what you could do digitally, and you thought so what sparked the idea for that, for wavetables and that kind of thing?
Well, I mean, again, it's a combination of old and new, right? So we're looking at legacy again. It's easier to talk about things with people if you can tie it into something that they already know about. And so the TDL series was this very cool series of hybrid analog digital synths that Korg did back in the 80s. And so we thought, okay, well, that's an interesting thing. But and they talked about them as wavetable synths, but at the time it was just it was static wavetables, right? They were like a Prophet VS in terms of playing back a wavetable and then processing it through digital filters. But these were very, very early ones, so they just had a set of wavetables like you would have a set of analog waveforms, and that was it. They didn't crossfade. They're like the VS did cool things with moving around in this vector space with 4 wavetables, and the DW was I believe before that, and just had these static wavetables. So we're thinking, well, okay, we really love the idea of a wavetable synth. There are some very cool wavetable synths, especially in plugins right now. There are some wavetable synths. Of course, Waldorf has done wavetable synths for a long time. So what can we do that's different there? Because again, we don't want to just produce Me Too synths, right? So we thought, well, if we were making a DW synth now, it would certainly be doing crossfading, in sets of waves. But what are some other things that we could do? And there's this really neat thing that's true with wavetables and not true with samples. You can't do this with wave sequencing, but everything's always in phase. And so if you crossfade between things in level, it's the same as sort of morphing them. You don't hear the phase differences that you would hear if you tried to blend a flute sample into a trumpet, for instance, if you're just using volume. And instead you hear this thing where the waveform just kind of changes. So we added this second dimension to the Modwave. So you have your table, but then you also have multiple tables. So you're sweeping through a list of tables, but then you've got 2 lists of tables, and you can sweep through both of them, right? And that's your A/B control. And so that automatically gives you so many more choices, because you aren't stuck with just the timbres in the tables that you've got. You can mix them with other tables. And of course, one of the really cool things about this is that the tables don't need to be the same length. So you can have one table which just has 4 or 5 waveforms, and another table which has 64 waveforms. And as you sweep along the tables, you might still be in the first waveform on table A, but be in the 12th waveform on table B. And so you can get all sorts of new sounds out of things just from using that. So that was one thing. And we thought exploring morph stuff. So Serum does some interesting things with morph, which is basically most of them are ways of looking at your phase increments. So you have a sawtooth wave that sweeps through the wave tables, and I don't know how technical you want to get with this, but in a normal way of looking at it, you play back your table, right? And the way you do that is you've got a sawtooth wave that's going up and then going down. And so for every cycle of the sawtooth wave, it plays one cycle of your table, and that means that for every they align completely in terms of time. So, but if you modulate your index into the table, then you can produce these interesting sort of pulse width modulation effects. And so we did a bunch of different things there that I think again, give life to the tables and make them sort of more animated, because one of the problems with wavetables is that they have a tendency to sound kind of cold and sterile. So if you if you play with them in real time, especially if you change the slope of that phase increment, then that produces neat things. And of course, chaos physics was this other thing that, again, we had been sort of talking about, looking for something to attach it to, and chaos physics worked very well with the Modwave. So I'm happy with that merger. I'm giving you very long answers.
Yeah, to these are good answers. Though, I mean, what I found particularly, I think I've never got. I mean, I've had since one of my first synths was a DX100, which is up there from in '86, yep. And I've never really got into a synth as much. I've had various Korg, I've got MS2000 there, but the Modwave has somehow grabbed me more than any others I found to create my own patches, and I think it's because there's no rules on. You can have the filter modified by the key tracking, or you can have it modified by the LFO, or you can have the LFO modified by something else, and you can have something else modified something else, and there's no set rule to it, and that's what I think I really have enjoyed for sound design, because listening to a sound and I think, well, how have they done that? And I think, well, they've modified this and this, so I'll do it, and there's no blocks to it. That's what I say. And then you've got the motion sequencer, which you could use as a 64-step envelope, or you can use it as a traditional sequencer. It's that flexibility, I think, that really opened up the Modwave for me.
Very cool. Very cool. Yeah. With so when we were doing the OASYS, we had a bunch of meetings with the sound developers and Korg's voicing team. At the time, it was still the MIDI Patch Boys was their name. There was a bunch of very, very great people. One who unfortunately just passed away very recently, Michael Geisel. But other people, Steve McNally and John Lemcool, otherwise known as Skippy, and I'm not sure if Peter Schwartz was involved in OASYS, but John Bowen, of course, and Michele Paciulli, and I'm sure I'm missing people here. Stephen Kay, who did Karma and was also involved.
Karma's there.
Yeah. So all of these people got together and were kind of hashing out this, to a certain extent, the algorithms, but like the control algorithms. So, okay, we're going to have envelopes. They're going to look like this, and the envelopes will have these modulation controls. And everyone had things that they had wanted to do, but they hadn't had enough at the time. AMS inputs, right? Modulation inputs to something. Alternate modulation system, I think was what it is. Alternate modulation source. And so you had these fixed slots. You could say, well, you can modulate envelopes in this way. You can modulate LFOs in this way with this many controls. And if you wanted to add a third thing and there were only 2 slots, then you were out of luck. And we added some things at the time. We added these mod processors, I think, to the OASYS, if I remember correctly. So we did something so you could kind of eke a little bit more out of the system. But in general, we had to decide on a fixed structure because that's the way that everything worked. And each of the guys had something that they would want to do that would be tricky and interesting and needed just one more modulation routing. We had fights about it because it's, well, how do we fit this stuff on the screen? How do we make room for the CPU to do all of these things, because it's having to kind of loop through all of these things every voice. It's not free. It's not free to add modulation. And so when it came time to do this new set of synthesizers, and this actually started with the Vox Continental and the Grand Stage, we were thinking we don't want to have those meetings. We don't want to have to argue about about every one of the modulation routings and find the perfect mix that will apply to everyone's unique needs, because people have different ways of making sounds, right? And so one of our engineers had the idea of just making it completely freely selectable. So it's what programmers call a dynamic list. So for anything that's modulatable, you just kind of can add however many you want. It's actually, the limit is 31 now, going into a single destination. So if you want to modulate filter cutoff, you can have 31 things going to filter cutoff. And that's just because that, again, this stuff isn't free, and that turned out to be a convenient number. And if it ever really becomes a problem, then we can. But in general, the idea is to have something that's mostly infinite. And again, the question of what can you modulate? Well, we thought, there are only a few things that it's actually uncomfortable to have modulation on, that we can't do without clicking or glitching or doing something else. So instead of deciding what can be modulated, we said we're going to decide what can't be modulated, and then everything by default can be modulated unless there's a reason not to. So anyway, that was our response to that. And again, I gave you a very long answer.
Yeah, well, that's a good answer, because I think to be honest, I was drawn in by wavetables.
Yeah.
But then what kept me on the synth is the modulation routine. I think that's really what makes that I could listen to a JX3P sound thing. I can recreate that because I can do this routine, and then I can listen to a D50 and think, oh well, that kind of does this, so I can do that way. And that's what's enabled me to create the sound sets really without using samples. Is because there's always a way. That's what I found really interesting with it. So yeah, it surprised me how much the Modwave, I've enjoyed programming that, and I like the combination of the software editor and the hardware. So the combination working, I always have both open at the same time. I think that's I know you can do everything from the synth more or less, but I like having the combination of both. What was the reason for going for that full scale editor?
Well, if you are making sounds, sometimes it's nice to be able to see a lot of what's going on. So for the editors, we actually take a little bit different approach. If you look at Modwave Native, for instance, there is less going on a single screen. The idea there being that it's someone who is wanting to use the plugin and wants kind of a comfortable editing experience. With the plugin, what we wanted to do is to make something that is easily digestible in the same way that the front panel is, but then also very capable. And so you end up paging through a little bit more in the plugin, and we broke things down into more digestible steps. With the editor, we sort of went the opposite direction. With the editor, what we're trying to do is show you as much as possible, because again, that's something that in particular sound developers really want to have, is to just be able to see everything, even if it's not as pretty as it could be if you made things more beautifully spaced and took gave room for the eye to breathe and that sort of thing. With the editor, the idea is you want to see a whole lot of things at once. You want to be able to grok the entire sound, and so that's what we're trying to do with the editors. The other thing, yeah.
So the editors are really, I really do find them really useful for sound design. I wanted to talk about the plugin versions as well, because that's something I think that's pretty different about the Modwave and the Wavestate. Is there is native versions of them. So what was the reason for going for that route?
Well, I'll tell you. This has been a controversial thing also. There's sort of the concern, we just saw the Crush ad, right? I don't know if you saw the iPod Crush ad or the iPad Crush ad. This was a big controversy that just occurred where Apple made sort of a marketing misstep in trying to explain how they were taking all these creative tools and now they're just in this iPad. But what they did was to actually physically crush a whole lot of things like pianos, musical instruments, and artistic tools and that sort of thing. But that's one of the things that has been happening, right, in reality. So it used to be that you had to have, and that I had, a big mixing board here and a whole lot of outboard effects and to a certain extent more outboard synthesizers than I have now. And now a lot of that stuff is just living inside the DAW. And so I was seeing something very curious, which is that going back to, the beginning of the millennia anyway, around OASYS times and early Kronos times, all of my friends who were professional musicians would always be interested in buying our latest hardware. So if we brought out a new, very cool workstation, for instance, these guys were always, can I get a deal? Can you set me up with an accommodation on that? How can I get an artist endorsement on this? And so a lot of my friends are more in the production or music for film and television and video. And these guys just stopped asking for hardware. They stopped asking for deals on hardware. And I thought about that. I noticed it. And I noticed that these guys were professionals who were making money off of music, who were spending thousands and thousands of dollars every year on musical tools. But now instead of spending it on hardware, mostly, they were spending it on plugins. And so it's a very pragmatic thing, but it also expresses where the market is. And so I started talking to people about this, and these are people who are actually spending money, but they need tools that are in the box that work with their workflow. And these are guys who actively don't want more hardware pieces. They have tons of hardware already. They do sometimes buy hardware, but it's less convenient for certain workflows to have hardware than software. And I'll talk more about that in a moment, because I realized some other things about hardware in the process of making these devices. And so this is just it's a real market. It's users who would be open to purchasing our products, who would be open to using our products, who I think need these sounds, who we're simply not serving. We're not serving them because the products that we're making don't fit into the way that they make music. So for that segment of people, I thought it was very important. And I was inspired by, for instance, Line 6, noticing the way they did things with Helix and Helix Native. So Helix Native is a fully compatible version of their Helix floor processors. And you can exchange sounds between the two. You can use Helix Native in your DAW, just the way that you would use a Helix floor processor on stage. They're premium products, so they're not bargain priced. But the idea of taking something which could be used in as many different scenarios as possible, I thought was a great idea. And since these were, already software-based instruments, and again, my group has been into software-based synthesis since the first OASYS back in the mid-1990s. We've thought that it's better. Synthesis is better if you can just do anything. So you use a general purpose processor of some sort, whether it's a custom DSP or an off-the-shelf DSP, as we had in the OASYS PCI, or Intel processors or now ARM processors. Doesn't really matter. It's all floating point math, and well, now it's all floating point math. It used to be all fixed point math, but it's something that we can do to express these synthesizers. And now these synthesizers actually build for our hardware, which is running on ARM. They build for Windows PCs running on Intel, and they build for Macs running on both Intel and ARM. So we have the same synthesizer running on all these different platforms. And in some of them, it's a box with knobs and a keyboard, and in some of them, it's just the software part. And I think that's exciting. So, sorry, I give long answers, and I apologize for that.
Okay.
The other thing that you can do with software is to have a different UI, right? So chaos physics, for instance, in the Modwave Native, gives you a great picture of what's going on. So you can see the way that you can see friction, you can see tilt. You get a higher resolution picture of what's happening with the ball. You get better pictures of the depression or hill in the plane. So you can express things differently in software. You can do drag and drop modulation. You were talking about how easy modulation is, right? And the editor also supports drag and drop, but of course you can't drag and drop on a hardware synth. It just doesn't work that way. But being able to use drag and drop, being able to see big lists of modulation, being able to see modulated values, I think is a key thing. So you can see not just where the knob is set to, but also where the knob is moving to. So all of these little things are, most of which are very natural for software, are advantages that you can have for that system. So it's not simply taking something and putting it everywhere and having it work exactly the same. It's taking this core synth and putting it in an environment and saying, what can we do that's special here? On the hardware, we can have knobs that you can close your eyes and still kind of know where everything is with the Wavestate and Modwave, and with software, we can do things visually that we can't do with the hardware. So that's neat. And the final thing that I realized was that was thinking about this trend of people who are eschewing computers entirely. They're saying, I get plenty of computers at work. I don't want to be staring at a computer when I go home and make music. And so those people, I think the UIs for the Wavestate and Modwave really turned out to be very good for that, because they're very hands-on, because you can reach out and you can, attack is always in the same place, release is always the same place, cutoff is always in the same place. So you get this sort of beautiful muscle memory that you get from hardware synths going back to the mini Moog. And there's a visceral enjoyment and pleasure in dealing with something that's tactile. So I don't know. It's been interesting thinking about how these hardware and software versions fulfill different needs for different people.
Yeah, and I found working with the combination of the two. So initial sound design I often do with the editor and the hardware synth. So I've got them here, so in front of me. But quite often, and I sometimes I'm on lunch and I'm in the office and I've no keyboard there, right, but I've still got the Modwave native here on my laptop, so I can do some sound design and some tweaking, and it's got the keyboard on there, so I can hear the sounds, and I run the arpeggiator just while I'm tweaking things. But then I found when I'm actually doing track recording, I'll work on say I'm doing the bass line with the Modwave, and okay, I've got this right now, so I save the patch, load it up in the native,
yep, and
use that. Right, now on the next track, we do the pad sound, and so on. So you don't have to always record. Because what I normally do is do it to get the sound right, do the MIDI, then record the audio, and then the next track. But now I just push it to a native version, and then if my laptop starts to scream a bit, I can just freeze them. But then if I need to tweak anything, you can you can tweak it. And so I found that workflow of starting with it on the reel and then pushing it to the native once you've done once you're happy with it roughly. That works really well. So that combination of hardware and software works well for me. So so you've got the two synths there. Now I'm a big fan of the Korg Collection, which is the Legacy Collection, now the Korg Collection, and so I've got all those installed, and I do find those really useful. But I did see that there was an announcement that there's a couple of new things coming to the Korg Collection. One particularly interesting was the ARP 2600.
Yeah, so we're actually really involved with the Korg Collection this time around, and especially with the 2600 and the Vox Continental model, both of which are really fun and were done by our groups. And in fact, both of them were spearheaded by the same engineer who's really, really great at digging into hardware and figuring out how it works and figuring out how to recreate that in software. And I'm kind of hoping that the Vox Continental model will be noticed a little bit more. It was first in the Vox Continental hardware synthesizer that was released a few years ago, but it's very quirky. It's lovely. It has its own special sound, and it's really very, very well expressed in this model. And so what I'm staring over here at is I have a 2600M on my desk, and so that guy who had dug into the Vox Continental a few years ago has been digging into this for a long time now. It's stunning, actually. We've been working on it for more than a year, a very long time. And it's been a really neat project. For me as a designer, it's been interesting because what we've tried to do is to take a 2600 and really implement it very well in software, and then make additions to it, but not make it a different synth than what it already is. So the challenge was to take its character and say, okay, we're in software now, we can do a little bit more. Also, it's many decades later, so we have a few different ideas about how synthesizers might work. How can we expand this in a way that is consistent with the original philosophy? And one of the things you realize when you look at the 2600 is that there is not a single thing on it which is duplicated. each of these modules is different. There are 3 VCOs and they're all different. There are a couple envelopes and they're different. There are 3 voltage processors and they're all different. And so one of the temptations, right, especially if you're in software and, at least from a parts standpoint, there's no parts cost for making all 3 oscillators like VCO2, which is the most featureful of the 3 oscillators. But it takes away something from the device, I think, to make everything the same. So we did a bunch of things, like we added another envelope, we added another LFO. Actually, the original 2600, technically speaking, didn't have an LFO. The oscillators could work as LFOs, and then the keyboard module had a vibrato LFO, which you could then use for other things. But we added another filter, we added various other things. But all of those, we didn't just duplicate something that was there. We brought in a new design. And for me as a product designer, the challenge there was getting myself into this different headspace. This wasn't entirely my product. I had to take, I thought that the correct approach was to figure out what was neat and beautiful about the 2600, and based on that, create a revision of the product that did something new and exciting, but that didn't break what was beautiful about the old product. So, other things that we did were studying all of the mods that people had made, because again, it's been out there for decades, and people would say, gosh, I really wish I could do this. I wish you could do this. And they would hire techs to add jacks and to add other features. And so there are tons of different ARP 2600s out there with different mods, but there's some that everyone seemed to agree were useful. And so we added those mods in too. It's just neat being able to work with a synth with such a legacy and such history, that you can draw on to learn about it. And again, this synth it's really quirky. It does all sorts of little weird things inside, and it's just fun. And I think that learning enough about the product, the original product, to be able to then express that in a new product, that was an enjoyable challenge for me.
Yeah, and that's going to be available as part of the Korg collection.
Right. Yeah. So the Korg Collection 5 will come out, and it'll be an upgrade to previous ones. So there'll be upgrade pricing for people who have previous versions of the Korg Collection and everything, and it'll have the 2600, the Vox Continental, and the EP1. So a slightly updated version of the piano that's in the Kronos.
Oh, that's it. I'm really looking forward to this, because the 2600 is one of those things that I'd really like to have a play with those. I haven't got the space for one, and I sort of kind of couldn't justify it, but to myself to actually buy one. But having the software one there is interesting, and I guess so. You can do all the things where you put the virtual patch cables in, a bit like the MS-20 software when you can plug the so you can have a go at patching your own up and all that kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, that's really the lifeblood of the 2600. So when they made the 2600, the sort of the value add was that you of course had to have those patch points. The value add was that they were normal to something, so you didn't need to use patch cables. So the assumption at the time was that you had to use patch cables, and the 2600 sort of subverted that by adding in all these normalized connections. But yeah, it's really a challenge in terms of figuring out what the original thing could do. There are some features actually that aren't even talked about in the manual, but then if you look in the patch book, you look, it's called the 2600 patch book. They have 100 sounds in there, and there are a couple of these example sounds that have a particular patch, a connection that you go, we all scratched our heads, but that's okay. But that's normally they're patching an output to an output there. Why are they doing that? And then we figured out that there are some undocumented features in the 2600. It's not mentioned in the manual at all, but you connect the output to the output and something else interesting happens. So it's so all of that patching is is really neat. And, all of it, of course, is also happening at audio rates. So there's nothing that's, there's no difference between a control signal and an audio signal in the 2600. With the VCOs, they're just completely set up to work either at low frequencies or at audio frequencies. And if you want to use low frequencies, you just flip this little switch. Each of the 3 oscillators has a switch between audio and low frequency, and then you use it as a low frequency oscillator. As I say, on the original 2600, if you exempt the keyboard, there's no LFO at all. You just have 3 oscillators, and they're fast or they're slow, so they can go up really, really fast or down to, very, very, very slow. So, anyway,
that's going to be a lot of fun to play with when that comes out. I'm really looking forward to giving that a try, and to seeing whether I can do any patch creations on a 2600. I think it's going to be complicated at first when you see all the the routing and things, but I think it's a bit like the Modwave. When I first got the Modwave, I kind of thought, well, the presets, I like the presets, but there's no way I'm going to be able to create anything like the presets. But the more you play with it, the more it rewards you with spending time with it, and you start to understand it. And then, now I feel like I pretty much know my way around it. And like I said earlier on, I spent more time with this than probably any other synth. And it's probably the single biggest advice for anybody buying synths is to buy one thing and spend a long time on it and get to know it before you buy the next thing. So I've just got the Wavestate, but I really have spent a good chunk of time on my way, and I think that's with the 2600. I probably try and focus and zone in on that, and then I got a feeling I can get some interesting sounds out of it, because I'm sure it'll ship with some great sounds with it, and there's lots of YouTube videos of people with the actual 2600s and the 2600Ms that you can learn from as well.
We were talking about systems of where you stack up a bunch of simple systems. And that's exactly what a 2600 is. So I think that the important thing is to think about it, instead of looking at the whole panel and going, there are lots of patches there and lots of sliders, you look at one module at a time. And each of those modules is really pretty simple. So if you understand, if you start with VCO1, which is the simplest of the oscillators, and I think it's the simplest for a reason. It's the first thing that you encounter after the input. And it's got some modulation for the frequency, and then you can set an initial frequency, and you got your fine-tuned slider, which was critical because they didn't have stepped frequencies on an original 2600. So all of the instructions start with tuning. How do you what do you do to tune the oscillator to start? And it's got a couple of waveform outputs and has some inputs for controls, and you understand that, and then you can move on to the next oscillator. And the original manual actually is really great about that, and kind of saying, okay, what can we do with this? And then we combine, eventually it starts, we can combine this module with this module, and what do these things do? So you learn about it as a set of systems. It's not just one big thing. It's this thing that does this, and often with the ARP 2600, it's this thing that does these 3 things. And then once you understand what each of them do, then you can learn how to combine them and play with them. And really, also, if you look at that manual, it's about exploration. It'll say, well, we know what happens when we do this and this and this, and then try this other thing. And I can't really describe it, and I can't necessarily tell you what you'll get out of it, because when you have a bunch of these kind of sufficiently robust small systems and you put them all together, you can get completely new things out of it. And that's, again, one of the fun parts of dealing with it. So yeah, I would say when you approach it, do that. One of the things that original manual by a guy named Jim Mitchmerhusen, I'm not going to be pronouncing his last name entirely correctly. He is still around in Boston and ran a synthesizer lab for a long time, and has been very influential there. And he wrote this fantastic manual for the original 2600, which is completely different from modern manuals. It really doesn't so much go through and say, this slider does this, this jack does this. Instead, he says, well, let's look at, we're going to explore this system, and you're going to go in and connect this and slide this slider and listen to it, and then do this other thing and patch from here to there. And he walks you through those systems and the way they interact. And it's a beautiful thing. So when we were making ours, we did a couple things that we thought were really important about trying to allow someone to grok it. So the original 2600 is it's a white silk screen over a dark gray background. And we have that skin, but then we have a substitute skin which just colors each of the modules based on whether they generate a signal, process a signal, whether they generate a modulation signal, or whether they're dealing with control signals like from a keyboard. And so just that, you turn on the color screen, and now all of a sudden you kind of have a map to doing what. And then the other thing we did was to have online help for everything, and I've actually put a lot of effort into the help. The help was the basis of the manual as opposed to the other way around. So it's full of tips as to how things work and how things interact. And so hopefully people can learn about synthesis, and certainly learn about the 2600 from the experience of working with the plugin. It's a goal.
I think I'm looking forward to when that comes out, because I've got the key stage, so I can hook it up with the key stage, which would be a nice controller and a nice control surface for that, because you could map those controls, can't you, on the key stage to the filter or whatever, or the envelopes or whatever you want on that. So I'll have a go at doing that.
It's worked well, and you've been making such fantastic sounds with Modwave. I'm looking forward to seeing what you do with that.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to trying. Well, it's been absolutely fascinating getting you on, Dan. I knew it would be, and I've really enjoyed talking to you. It's great to hear from you, and a big thanks to you and the team for producing some amazing instruments over time and over the years. So I really do appreciate you joining on the show tonight. Really enjoyed chatting to you.
I enjoyed talking with you, Ian. Thanks.
Thanks, Dan. That was absolutely brilliant. Really enjoyed that. I knew I would. You can email me, ian@thisisLifestyle.com. Please like and subscribe if you like the show. I've got some more sound collections for the Modwave coming soon as well, and the Wavestate. So we'll be back next week with more news. I think we might be talking new Surface products next week, but stay tuned for that. I will see you next week.